Good evening, everyone. My name is Alec Winter. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Trustees here at Pathways Church. I want to thank everyone for coming. This is an incredible crowd. Hello, everyone upstairs. I've never seen this room this full, that's for sure. We're very happy to have the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Andrew Seidel, here. As Unitarian Universalists, the separation of church and state is very important to us. It's a very serious issue for us, and we fight towards that end. So it's good to have you all there. If anyone has any questions about UU, feel free to find me. I've got my little tag on and everything, or come by on a Sunday. Bathrooms are back here. We've got refreshments off to the side. Anything else? All right, I'm just bringing R.N. Raw, and he's going to take it from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And this is a, hey, I'm recognizing people. Andrew L. Seidel, well, I think there was another Andrew Seidel, but he wanted to distinguish himself from them, so he decided to give him L.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
Andrew L. Seidel is a Bachelor of Science, Neuroscience and Environmental Science, which means in both cases he must be in hell right now in our current political situation. He's also a Doctor of Jurisprudence and a, am I pronouncing this right, Lega Magister, which means Master of Law. So, as well as a constitutional attorney and Director for the Strategic Response.
Director of Strategic Response, yeah.
Of Strategic
It's
Response
a made-up title.
at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Now, I first spoke to Andrew Seidel a couple of years ago when I had to assemble a team of experts on American secular political history for a video that I was doing about, the Texas Board of Education, who are determined to promote American exceptionalism, which means that they are religiously motivated to teach the lie that our Constitution and our system of government are based on a covenant between God and Moses, which is how one of our history textbooks describes that. Because our history textbooks in this state now describe Moses and the Ten Commandments and the Exodus as if they were all real things that really happened in history, which many historians would call false, especially those who are not determined to defend the faith. Now, of the 4 experts on my panel, all of whom I appreciated and enjoyed very much, I think that I might have had the most fun listening or chatting with Andrew Seidel, because he told me, he agreed, as they all did, that the first commandment contradicts the First Amendment. But he said that it's not just the First Commandment that does that; it's several of them. And he went over, we can't. He went on to say, you can't worship other gods before me. You can't make and worship idols. Well, that's freedom of expression. Yes, you can. You can't misuse the name of the Lord. That's freedom of speech, baby. Jesus Christ. You can say it all you want. That's my favorite quote. So when he published his book, The Founding Myth and why Christian Nationalism is un-American, I told him that I wanted to talk to him about it on my podcast, but I didn't really have time to read a whole book right now because I'm a busy guy and I got a lot of things going on. But then I read the accolades that had been written by other people like Hemet Mehta and David Niosi and Sarah Haider, people who I knew, as well as a whole bunch of other people, the notable names in secular activism, were all praising this book. And I said, I got to make time to read this, not just for the interview, but for myself. Because I want to know, I need to know what he knows about this topic that we're both so passionate about, that is so important to everybody in this room, and that increasingly affects everybody in our country, especially now. So it is my great honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce you to Andrew L. Seidel.
That was very kind. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you so much. I'm going to go up on stage because I can. Come up here. All right. So, Christian nationalism is, I am fully convinced, the single biggest threat to a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. For those of you who don't know what Christian nationalism is, why I wrote the book. That's also why I wrote this, because this is such a big threat. And Christian nationalism is the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, or the fallback idea that we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles. But there's another claim tied up in it that's actually really important, and it's that we've strayed from those founding principles. And that is probably the most important thread in Christian nationalism, because they use the language of return, the idea that we have to get back to our godly roots, to the religious roots of our founding, to justify all manner of public policy today. The goal really is to redefine what it is to be an American, so that to be an American is to be a Christian, and to be a Christian is to be an American. And before 2016, Christian nationalism was around. There have actually been cycles and waves of Christian nationalism throughout our history. But it really all changed in the 2016 election. The biggest predictor, the best predictor, the single best predictor of a Donald Trump voter in the 2016 election was not race. It was not political party, despite Republicans voting in overwhelming numbers for Trump. It was not religion, despite evangelicals supporting Trump in overwhelming numbers. The best predictor of a Trump voter in 2016 was thinking that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Right? If somebody thought that, they were going to vote for Trump. So Donald Trump and Mike Pence tapped into this undercurrent of Christian nationalism in our country. Before, it had been on the fringes of conservative politics, on the fringes of conservative religion. It was impotent. It had no power. It worked its way into a few court decisions, actually, and you would hear lip service would be paid to Christian nationalism during, for instance, the Republican primaries. But for the most part, it had no power. But that all changed in the 2016 election. Donald Trump tapped into this vein of Christian nationalism and rode it into the most powerful office in the history of the world. And since he has been in there, he has been passing and legislating these Christian nationalist policies. And you've all heard of them. The Muslim ban is a great example. Not only did it ban immigrants from Muslim-majority countries, it also favored Christians who wanted to come into this country. That's Christian nationalism. The child separation policy, kids in cages, however far away we are from the border right now, that was justified by the administration with Romans 13. They learned about this in the White House Bible study and justified separating families, splitting them apart and putting kids in cages at the border with the Bible. Christian nationalism. Project Blitz. How many people have heard of Project Blitz? I'm so happy because as I've been doing this tour, more and more hands are going up whenever I ask that question. For those of you who haven't heard of it, Project Blitz is a specifically Christian nationalist push. They are not shy about it. And the goal is to get state legislatures to pass Christian nationalist laws. So they actually created this handbook. It was put together by the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation and Wall Builders, which is David Barton's outfit. Nobody wants to boo and hiss David Barton? And it's actually a handbook of model laws that state legislatures can pass. And it starts off with things like In God We Trust being displayed in the public schools. How many people have heard about that recently? Yeah. And I'll let you ask questions, I promise. And it goes on to do more and more so that by the end, they're actually codifying a license to discriminate. They're going to allow they're going to create a second class. So Christians will be this favored class, everybody else will be second-class citizens. That is the explicit goal of Project Blitz. Opposition to gay marriage, LGBTQ rights. All of that is exclusively Christian nationalist. So is the push to take away a woman's right to reproductive choice. Now, the good news about all this is that the political theology of Christian nationalism is actually incredibly weak and vulnerable. And that is because it is based on this house of lies and myths. And you have heard these lies and myths repeated everywhere. Donald Trump loves to trot these out. We are one nation under God. In God we trust. The Founding Fathers prayed during the Constitutional Convention, so we can pray at all of our government bodies. George Washington knelt in the snow in prayer at Valley Forge. Every president has said, "So help me God," when they take the oath of office. The Declaration of Independence, it says 4 times, references the Christian God 4 times. Or our nation was founded on the 10 Commandments. Right? All of these are wrong. But all of them are central to Christian nationalism's hold on political power in this country. So without their common well of myths and lies, their identity will wither and fade. So I think we have a unique opportunity here because of the historical distortions that they've based their entire identity on. We can completely destroy it and undermine it. And that is the goal of the founding myth, simple but lofty, to utterly destroy the myths that underlie Christian nationalism. Now, the book is not simply a refutation of the idea that we're a Christian nation, because that's not enough. Right? If facts were enough right now, Donald Trump would not be president. So I wanted to go deeper. Clap for that, that's fine. And so after the Christian nation claim, well, how many people here have been in a debate about the idea that we're founded as a Christian nation? Not a real debate, like formal, but online with your family, whatever. So a lot of hands going up. How many of you have found that you can successfully fight back against it, but then there's that fallback claim? Well, what I actually meant was we're based on Christian principles, or we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles. A lot of heads nodding, a lot of hands, yeah. That is what I actually wanted to attack in this book. Because if you can disprove that claim, it automatically disproves the idea that we're a Christian nation. So the question that I set out to answer in the founding myth was this: did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And the answer to that is no, they did not. Not only did they not influence our nation's founding, it's a good thing they didn't. Because those principles, and especially the ones that are central to Christian nationalism, are fundamentally opposed to the principles on which this nation was built. There is such conflict and disagreement that it is fair to say, albeit bluntly I will admit, Christianity is un-American. So that is the argument that I make in the founding myth. I'm also lucky because it happens to be the truth, so there's that. And now, how many people here are former churchgoers? Ooh, okay, so I apologize for what's about to happen next. We are going to have some readings. My publisher insists that I do readings at these things. I feel a little awkward doing them to this crowd in particular because I don't want to give anybody like PTSD or anything like that. But so I'm going to do just 4 short readings, one from each part of the book. So I organized the book into 4 different parts. And the first part is all about the Founding Fathers and our colonial history and the Declaration of Independence. And there's a ton of misinformation out there about that. And if you've got specific questions afterwards, I would love to answer them. But one of the biggest things that you always end up debating when you're having this conversation is the religion of the Founding Fathers. What did they actually believe? And so I'm going to read from part 1, and I'm going to explain why I think that's silly. Though interesting, the battle over what the founders personally believed is irrelevant to the claim that our nation was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. That the founders had personal beliefs about religion and God does not prove that they used those principles to found this nation. One's personal theistic beliefs do not own the other ideas generated by that mind. Now, of course, designing a nation is difficult, but religion cannot be assumed to influence it. Those religious beliefs, whatever they may have been, must be examined and compared against the principles that informed our country's design. Right? So that second point, that last point that I just made, that you actually have to look at the principles. Even if all the founding fathers were Jesus died and has risen from the dead Christians, which they definitely were not. But even if they were, we can concede that, because it doesn't mean that they based the nation on those principles. So you'd still have to say they were Christians and they used that Christian principle to build our nation. And so that is what I tried to do in part 2 of the book. So because I'm a lawyer and I thought I was clever, part 2 is called United States v. the Bible. Like it's a case, but it's not. Lawyers we're not funny. And what I'm trying to prove in this part of the book, what I'm doing is walking through those principles that are really central to Christianity and Judeo-Christianity, and I'm comparing them against our founding principles. I'm trying to show that conflict and disagreement. So this is from chapter 10, which is called Redemption and Original Sin, which you all know are principles that are central to Christianity, or personal responsibility and the presumption of innocence, which are central to the American founding. The American system of justice, government, and perhaps our entire society rest on the principle that people are personally responsible for their actions. The entire Christian religion is based on a singular claim that violates the principle of personal responsibility so critical to our systems, that Jesus died for your sins. So Christianity's rejection of personal responsibility is actually twofold. First, a person is guilty of original sin simply because they were born. To believe this, you must accept not only that all humans descended from the two originals that God created for his garden, but also that all human beings are culpable for the actions of those two forebears whose disobedience was prompted by a talking snake millennia ago. Guilt without action is rare under our system of justice. Guilt without action is rare under our law, but it is the law in much of Christianity. Second problem, the sacrifice of Jesus means that one's sins are forgiven. This is vicarious redemption through human sacrifice. Jesus as the sacrificial scapegoat. Each idea is repugnant to American principles in its own way. Original sin confers guilt without regard for personal actions, while vicarious redemption absolves that guilt through the torture and murder of another human being. Right? Fundamental disagreement. You cannot reconcile those principles. It is absolutely not possible. Part 3 of the book is where this book began. The book actually began as a law review article that just got really, really out of hand. I read a Supreme Court opinion, that is delicious, thank you, where one of the justices said that, yeah, the Ten Commandments totally influenced the American system of law. I thought, well, that can't be right. And I set out to investigate that idea. And it sort of spawned this book with a little help from an article Christopher Hitchens wrote in Vanity Fair. He rewrote the Ten Commandments. Anybody remember that one? Yeah. A few heads nodding. So that kind of started me down this path. And the next section, part 3 of the book, is all about the Ten Commandments. I walk you through each one of the Ten Commandments and explain why all of them, not just the ones that are mentioned at the beginning, are fundamentally opposed to our system of law and justice. All of them. Yes, even the ones where you're thinking, but not those, because those overlap totally. Yes, even those. But if you want to understand why you have to buy the book, I'm not going to give that away here. I will, however, read a little bit from the first chapter of that part, which is chapter 13, and it's called Which 10? The Ten Commandments, also known as the Decalogue, supposedly the most moral law known to humanity and supposedly authored by the biblical God himself, are not easy to find in the Bible. They're not at the beginning of the Bible. God didn't give the rules to Eve and Adam even after their fall. Nor did he give them to Noah after exterminating all human and animal life save Noah's crew. And Noah needed a bit of moral guidance. Noah's son Ham accidentally walks in on Noah drunk, naked, and passed out. Refusing to take personal responsibility for his frat boy behavior, Noah curses an innocent child, curses an innocent child. Canaan, Ham's son and Noah's own grandson, to a life of slavery for the crime of seeing Noah naked. This was the only man the Jewish God thought moral enough to save from a worldwide flood. Yahweh didn't see fit to give out the laws, his most moral laws, if Christian nationalists are to believe, until much further along in the biblical storyline. The first set, there are 4, doesn't appear until halfway through the second book of the Bible, Exodus. H.L. Mencken reportedly once quipped, "Say what you will about the 10 Commandments, you must always come back to the pleasant fact that there are only 10 of them." If this wit does indeed belong to Mencken, then so does the error. There are not 10 commandments, but 4 different sets of 10 commandments. And there are big differences between them. And that's because, first of all, there are no small religious differences. There's no such thing as a small religious difference when you claim to have the absolute truth on the basis of no logic, reason, or facts, but faith. I mean, and if you think about it, some religions interpret the commandments to prohibit killing. Some prohibit murder. That's the difference between being able to defend yourself when somebody breaks into your house at night and not. Some prohibit graven images. Others prohibit idols. Now, I don't know what the difference is between those two, and I don't care. But the church went to war with itself over that issue. There was a civil war in the church in the 8th and 9th centuries called the Iconoclast controversy over whether or not the 10 Commandments ban idols or graven images. No small religious differences. So, part 4 of the book is the part that I'm kind of a little bitter that I even had to write this. The argument is so bad that I didn't feel like I should have to refute it. But it's also the argument that you hear most often. In God we trust, one nation under God, so help me God. All that nonsense. So, I'm going to read just a brief part from that and then conclude, and we will start Q&A. In God we trust, one nation under God, God bless America. These tidbits are not historical so much as they are rhetorical. Their tardiness precludes any arguments that they somehow prove the founding ideology. Right? None of them were added by the founders, all much later. But it's worth analyzing how the verbiage entered the American vernacular, because doing so reveals something interesting about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalists take advantage of times of national fear and strife and use them to impose their religion on everyone else. When doing so, they often destroy earlier unifying messages with their new divisive message. Now, Christian nationalists ignore this logic, and they recite these religious idioms, each more delinquent relative to the founding than the next, to bolster their arguments. In each instance, the truant language entered the American vernacular during times of fear and national crisis. During a war in one case, and in another case, at a time when witch hunters were looking for nonconformists and non-Christians, while big business was peddling religion to try to repeal regulations. In the final instance, the intent was to cover the most notorious presidential crimes ever committed. I wrote that last line before the Mueller report was published. It's a grain of salt and all that. But that is what makes the founding myth different. Other people, other historians, have offered a gentle correction to the Christian nationalists, right? Guys, this is what history actually says. This is what President Jefferson actually said. And they've kind of left it at that. But correction isn't enough. Facts aren't enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't have President Trump. So pointing out errors is insufficient. So this book does that. The founding myth does that, but then it takes the next step. This book is an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Right? Not only are Christian nationalists wrong, their beliefs and their entire identity runs counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded. They are un-American. Thank you. So I think we're going to take questions now. I think we're going to take some questions. I think Arn's going to MC and kind of keep everybody in line. And if you don't ask a question, he's going to be my bodyguard, I think.
Okay.
And we're going to chat. I think you've got a few questions. So
Before we jump into that, I'm going to go upstairs where we have another big group and bring the microphone. So let's go every other question for a while until we're done with folks up there.
That's fine with me.
So we'll after the first question gets asked down here, then pause and let someone up there ask a question, and then we'll just keep going. And Andrew said you'll be here until the last question gets asked. So
How many people would you say are in attendance?
there's 94 downstairs. And I'll count when I get up there, and we'll give an official count for tonight. But yeah, this is an amazing crowd. We were so excited about this, but it was just enough that we could handle it. I don't know if you saw, we had to put chairs out over in this area as well.
I am thrilled so many people turned out. We actually, FFRF packed a whole other suitcase of books so that hopefully nobody got left behind. And we'll do that out there afterwards.
There are plenty of books. Andrew last night was in San Antonio, and the group FACT had him out to do his presentation there. And I'm friends with some of those folks, but I'm happy to tell them that we had twice as many as they had. So.
And I should say that I am judging Texas cities based solely on attendance to my talks.
That is right.
So Dallas is the best city right now, as far as I'm concerned.
An official count, 130 people here tonight.
Wow.
So, Andrew, somebody handed me a paper of some pre-form questions. And before we get started with the audience, I just want to start with the first one. Something about tax write-offs. Do you even want to address that one? I'll let you read that one.
Well, let's just take that as, does tax exemption for churches violate the separation of church and state?
Okay.
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I'll say the Supreme Court has said no. The Supreme Court has said that because tax exemption is available to all nonprofits and charities, that it's okay that it's extended to churches as well.
Now, isn't that on the condition that churches are not used as lobbying agents?
Yes.
Of course, they always are.
Yes. No. I mean, there are a lot of conditions that nonprofits and charities have to meet that churches don't. I actually just wrote an op-ed about this today. How many people heard about the priest in Pennsylvania, the Catholic priest who stole $100,000, used it
For Grindr?
for Grindr? Yeah, that happens all the time. It is not uncommon, and it happens all the time because unlike every other nonprofit and charity, churches don't file any financial disclosures with the IRS. So FFRF, we file a Form 990. It tracks every penny that comes in, every penny that goes out, because we want citizens to be able to see what is happening with the tax-exempt groups that they are basically subsidizing, right? We want to make sure that they're obeying the law, that charitable donations are going to charitable work. But churches don't do any of that.
It seems to me, I remember within the last couple of years, it seems, that there was somebody that got in trouble. He was part of one of those national family organizations, and anytime they use the word family in a religious organization, you know that they actually mean anti-gay. And so this guy got caught with somebody who came from an agency called Rent-A-Boy, and his advertised criteria was that he was 8 inches. But he looked a lot taller than that.
Is this Ted Haggard? I think it was Ted Haggard.
No, it's not.
No, not
Ted
Ted
Haggard is just one of a slew.
Yeah, that's just. But the point is, churches are actually vulnerable to this type of fraud and abuse because they don't have to do this. And so there are estimates that $63 billion is stolen annually from churches around the world, amounting to about 16% of the total revenue churches get is just lifted. And you know that number is underreported because it's who's going to admit to their church getting grifted. There's tons and tons of stories about it. Just the one I remember from before the Grindr priest was these 2 nuns who stole from the Catholic school, and they flew to Vegas every month, and they were blowing the money at the tables in Vegas. I mean,
Do you remember the one from, it was just a few months ago. He was a priest who's an anti-gay. He's a completely homophobic priest, but he's caught naked in a car with another man, and he declared it was an exorcism. That's what he's performing.
yeah, performing something. It's a roundabout way of saying that if we're going to treat churches equally, under the tax law, then they actually should be required to do the same things that everybody else does under the tax law. They're not. So I think right now the way they are treated is absolutely unconstitutional. And I think there's a good argument to be made that you could separate the church's actual charitable work, like if they run a soup kitchen out of their church, and let that be tax exempt versus the actual worship services, which we are all in effect subsidizing.
Now, before I read any more of the pre-formed questions, I would like to hear questions from the audience if anyone has any. First, you in the, wait, is that a Hawaiian shirt? Okay.
I just got back from a long road trip.
Okay. The long road trip shirt. Okay.
On the note of what you've just said, has it been considered to take the inverse of the same argument and get the theological exclusion to law, get for the non-theist?
Yeah,
Can
essentially.
you paraphrase that question to the microphone?
Yeah, I think the question is essentially have the non-theists tried to argue that non-theism or humanism is a religion and try to get that same kind of treatment under the law? And that has been done. The American Humanist Association, when they actually formed, did do that, and they argue regularly that humanism is a religion. They were just litigating a case like that for prisoners out in California that the Ninth Circuit just either today or yesterday rejected. I think it was today, rejected that case. It does happen, but it's, I mean, first of all, philosophically it's wrong. And it's a harder argument to make in the courts. And you're seeing it right now mostly with the prayer cases, where because the Supreme Court has already said, yes, governments can pray, the only thing we're left with doing is trying to get equal time for secular invocations. And now we're seeing courts saying, yeah, no, piss off. You are non-believers. You don't get to be a part of this. This is a religious ceremony.
I also want to throw in that I saw today somebody posting that Obama declared atheism to be a religion. So that means that teaching evolution was somehow a religious practice that shouldn't be allowed in schools. So we have to be very careful about how we understand or don't understand what happened.
It's actually a really common argument, though, is that having a separation of state and church is the same thing as enshrining atheism under the law, and it's a deceptive argument. And the Supreme Court actually adopted a variation of it in the Bladensburg Cross case. What they basically said was, look, if we were to strike down this was the 40-foot tall cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, that they just upheld a couple months ago. The Supreme Court said, look, if we were to strike this down as unconstitutional, that would be hostile to religion, which is absolutely idiotic. And it's an argument the court has rejected time and time again. So it's this deceptively simple argument it's gaining traction. I think the best way to explain it is with an example. And one thing that we deal with at FFRF all the time, and particularly in Texas all the time, is complaints about prayer at football games or with football teams. And so I always use that as an example. And if you have a government that is endorsing Christianity, that is the public school coach going out and telling his team, okay, Jesus is God, the Bible is right, now go out there and win one for me. Or win one for JC. If the government was endorsing atheism, the coach would say, there is no God, don't forget to read your Dawkins tonight, and go out there and win one for Hitch. A neutral government is one where the coach says, go out there and do your best, practice, play like we practiced, we got this. Right? That is what neutrality looks like. That's what a separation of state and church actually looks like. And that's what it should be. Right? The government shouldn't be taking sides one way or another. So when the government is secular, it's not actually an atheistic government. Another simple way to explain that to your friends is that there is no freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion.
And so many people don't understand that either, because I've had this argument with people in my own family so many times when I have to explain to them that Madeleine Murray O'Hare did not take prayer out of school. What she did was stopped Catholic kids from receiving Protestant prayers at the teacher's discretion, so that the teacher can no longer impose the teacher's religion on Jewish children, for example, or what have you. So and my family was mostly Mormon, so that they could kind of get that, you shouldn't be getting a Protestant or a Catholic-based, Christian instruction from your teacher, despite what the parents of the student's religion is. Mm-hmm. So at least the people who are aware of what religions are, and a lot of my family have no idea what a creed is. They're just better than me because they're Christian. But at least some of them who understand what the Mormon execution order and that sort of thing, at least some of them understand that there is a reason for secularization. That at least with some explanation, they get the idea of why we should have separation of church and state. And I would have thought that Mormons would be right on the ball with that, but sadly they've a lot of people have lost memory of laws that were just taken off the books in like 1976. Did you know that until 1976 it was legal to murder whole families of Mormons in this country? Yeah, not kidding.
Well, a law that was unenforceable was on the books is what he means. Just as here, you can't run for office if you're an atheist, which you can. It's not an enforceable law. And I would actually, I'm going to go on a little, sorry, tangent time.
You're not eating at my time, it's yours.
It's true. Yeah. I tend to be a little doom and gloom in the Q&A portion of these talks lately because of the federal courts. But one thing that I've been really trying to encourage everybody who comes to these things to do is give you activist things that you can go out and do, actual action plans. One of those is to start registering people to vote. Absolutely should be doing that as a group. Number 2 is getting out the vote as we get up to Election Day. And number 3, and I absolutely encourage this out of everybody, is to run for office. Every single person in this room is qualified to run for office. Every single one, except for I see some youngins here. You might have an age problem. But I know a few of you are thinking, I'm not. What do I know about running a county or getting on a school board?
Those people haven't met the politicians.
Look at the public officials. Look at them. Seriously. Every one of you is more qualified than somebody, most of the people in public office right now.
I ran for public office against somebody who was an absolute incompetent, who was also funded in the millions of dollars.
Make them spend it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not kidding. In the 1970s and 80s, the religious right, what I call Christian nationalism now, they went on a deliberate campaign to do this. And they had all of their folks running for school boards and city councils and county boards. And as they moved up throughout their careers, in the 90s, the late 2000s, they had this crop of politicians that they could tap for higher offices. I mean, this is where the Mike Pences of the world come from. This is why we're in the state that we're in, partly. And I would really encourage people, if it has ever crossed your mind, to seriously get out there and do it.
All right, there's 2 things I got to add to that. First is a statement. One, is that the reason that I became an activist myself was because Christian groups were telling me, bragging to me, how they had positioned certain senators and judges because their churches, their congregations had voted as a block the way their ministers told them to, which is illegal.
Illegal.
But it wasn't
Lose
just
your
one
tax
church.
exemption.
It was a whole bunch of different churches where the ministers are on the phone with each other saying, we want to elect these people because we want to effect these changes. Mm-hmm. So all of these different churches and a coalition of different congregations are all voting as a block to position these people. And they were bragging to me about the positions, the people that they had positioned, one of them being Rick Santorum.
See? You know what happened with him.
Yeah.
Who said that?
And the second one was a question to you. And I'm sorry, I spaced the question for the moment. It'll come back to me.
I think we've only let one person ask a question. Should we go upstairs?
Andrew, can you hear us up here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is God, and I'm really upset with you right now.
I don't care. You haven't successfully proved your existence. I apologize.
Well done. All right, we have our first question from upstairs. Hold on.
Hi, Andrew. This is Zach Moore. I'm up here in the packed attic.
Hi, Zach.
Hi, Zach.
Hey, all right.
One of my friends.
So I really appreciate being here. I love your book. I think you make a really strong argument against fundamentalist Christianity as sort of a Christian nationalism. But we're sitting here in a UU church, and I'm wondering if you would consider a sort of a fuzzy-wuzzy, squishy Christianity as something that would be harder for you to make an argument against in sort of government position.
Yeah, and I'm actually arguing, I'm going to be debating a fuzzy-wuzzy kind of Christian in a couple weeks at the University of Lexington, who argues that life, human dignity, liberty, and a few other things are Christian principles that influence the founding of the United States of America, which is nonsense, right? I mean, liberty is a universal human principle. It's not a Christian principle. And you enter the territory very, very quickly where I have a whole chapter in the book on the Golden Rule. And you'll often hear the claim that the United States was founded on the Golden Rule, which I've never actually heard anybody successfully make that argument. But the Golden Rule is not Christian, right? Every single human culture that we know of has some version of the Golden Rule, and most of them were written down centuries, and in some cases millennia, literally millennia, before Judeo-Christianity formulated it. So it's not fair to say that it's a Christian principle. It's simply arrogant to say that. So it is. That's the first part of the answer. And the second part is that secularism, secular ideas, secular values, secular citizens are constantly dragging liberal religion into liberal positions. Right? We are the driving force, for the most part, behind the liberalization of religion. And there is data to back this up. Professor Mark Smith wrote an entire book about this. He refers to it, it's counterintuitive. He refers to it as the tail wagging the dog. But you see this everywhere. Frederick Douglass said that revivals in religion go hand in hand with revivals of the slave trade. He said that because all the good arguments for slavery were religious. Right? There were few religious arguments on the abolition side, but most of the arguments were secular and eventually dragged religion into the abolitionist stance. Same thing with things like divorce, women's rights, LGBTQ. And I guarantee you, if you want to see this in action, you will see this in your lifetime, where secularism dragged religion into a liberal stance with LGBTQ rights, and 20 to 30, maybe 40 years from now, Christianity is going to be claiming credit for all the gains that the LGBTQ community made over the last 2 decades. I guarantee it. All right, put me down right now, God, and guarantee it. So that's the second part of the argument, is that a lot of the liberalization of religion is not even attributable to religion.
Yes, sir. Santa Claus.
Yes. It says Congress shall make no law. And I'm wondering if an attack has ever been tried from kind of the opposite direction, saying, well, all these exemptions from churches, those are laws. Isn't that against the regulation?
Yeah, so the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Goes on to enumerate 4 other rights as well. The language in that is very, very strong, actually. Shall is a command. Make no that's pretty clear. Law respecting is actually a very broad swath of laws.
Could we put in brackets the word even?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you
even respecting.
You could, that's the proper way to read it. And then if you go into the next part, which is the part that everybody wants to focus on these days, the religious liberty clause, free exercise clause is what we call it, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Prohibiting is a much narrower section of laws. You can burden somebody's religion, you can impinge it, you can infringe it, you can't prohibit it. That's what the Constitution says. So the Establishment Clause, which guarantees our secular government and guarantees your right to a secular government, should be read much more broadly than the Free Exercise Clause, which guarantees your right to worship as you see fit. So when the two come into conflict, the first should actually trump the second. But we're seeing the reverse right now. And we're also seeing this attempt to weaponize religious liberty entirely, which is
Which is why I get upset when they did the Church of the with the flying spaghetti monster, when they had the colander on, right, and somebody approves that they can get their driver's license picture with the colander on, because that's allowing religious privilege. You're free to believe whatever you're compelled to believe for whatever reason. You don't have to give justification. If you believe this, fine, you believe this, and you're willing, or you're free to live according to your own conscience on that, as long as it doesn't infringe on anybody else's rights. But you shouldn't be granted privilege because you believe something different than other people.
No, you're absolutely right, and you hit on the two crucial lines that we should draw. There's a difference between belief and action, right? You are absolutely free to believe whatever you want. Pope John Paul II believed in self-flagellation, whipping himself. He thought it would bring him closer to Jesus. Not my cup of tea. But go on, mortify that flesh. Do whatever you want to do to yourself. But you don't get to act on that beliefs when it starts to impinge the rights of others. And that's the key point. So action and belief are different, and once your action starts affecting the rights of somebody else, the government is absolutely free to step in. Thomas Jefferson said that the law reaches only our actions, and it does me no injury, doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg for my neighbor to say that there is no gods or 30 gods. But when your religion mandates picking pockets or breaking legs, the government can absolutely step in and tell your religion to stop it. And that is how you answer the debates about whether or not somebody has to serve a gay couple business. They don't get to violate somebody else's civil rights just because their God says so.
Okay, we're going to try to pick up the pace a little bit.
There was no more questions upstairs, so now we're going to be limited
Okay,
to
you had a
down
question?
here. Let me
Okay.
get her a microphone.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Bring in a microphone up. Oh, over this way?
Pass it. Oh, I'm sorry. We're over here first.
Just over here. Red tie.
We'll get to you. You had one, yeah.
No, I heard you on Brian Fisher radio show.
You were on Brian Fisher?
Yeah, I'll tell a little story about that afterwards. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say thank you for venturing over to that side as well,
Yeah.
the shark-infested waters.
I love doing those shows, actually.
And I just want to say thank you.
Okay, well, you're very welcome. So for those who don't know, Brian Fisher is how would you describe? I'll let you describe him.
I think he did it. Shark-infested waters.
So, and more so than you know, one of the legal interns.
This is the guy that said that Nazis, specifically by choice of Hitler, because gay Nazis would somehow be more cruel than regular Nazis, I guess?
He's out there even for a Christian nationalist. And so one of my legal interns came up to me after the interview, and he was saying, I could hear you in the office, and I was listening live, and you weren't coming through on a lot of what you were saying. It's like, so I went back and I actually found the video, and you can see their engineer. They have one of those videos set up in the studio, so they can show it live. He said, you can see the engineer muting your mic, sliding the bar all the way down when you start talking so that they can talk over you and get their point in, and then sliding it up so you just are in the middle of your thought. And so I had no idea that was going on at the time, obviously. So much more sinister than I even realized at the time. Yeah, most of the time I love going on with the crazier the better. It's a lot of fun.
On that note, we did open this to the public. So are there any believers in the room that want to ask a question? And we promise we'll be nice to you if you're here.
I did not make that promise.
You're not a believer, Don. Okay, all right. Well, we know our audience then. Question upstairs. Could you pass this back to her and then pass it back to her?
All right, so in your book, you make a distinction between the American government and the American culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in other books that I've read, it has been stated that America has a Christian culture.
Sure.
How do you navigate that, especially with your appearances and the way that culture influences politics and politics influences culture?
Yeah, I mean, because it doesn't really affect the central question that I'm trying to answer. Did those Christian principles influence the founding of our government? I mean, you can point to, we have the records from the Constitutional Convention. It's Max Foran edited 3 volumes. You can see them, you can read them, and they don't talk about the Bible. They don't talk about going to church. They don't talk about Christianity or the culture. And part of that is because they weren't as devout Christians as people like to assume. But to me, the question of whether or not America has a Christian culture is boring and pointless and irrelevant to the central question: did it affect our system of laws and government and justice? And so I try to dispose of that pretty early on in the book. And as far as dealing with that in my professional life, going and doing these talks and whether or not we have a Christian culture, and I don't care.
Yeah, I'd like to say that you did actually address this in your book in a different way, in explaining that it actually had a negative effect. That the Christian culture, being that we were the first people in the North American continent, people often declare to be Americans, like the Puritans, the first Thanksgiving and all of which we will not even begin to discuss because we know what's all wrong with that. But the people who founded the United States government looked upon the Quakers and the Puritans and the wars that they were having with each other, as well as with the indigenous people, and they realized that because they were fleeing religious persecution and brought religious persecution onto these shores. And so the founders of the United States said, we don't want any of that. We've already seen what this does. So we want a government that is not basing laws on religious perspectives.
That was actually one of my favorite chapters. The colonial chapter is one of my favorite chapters to write. I learned so much from it. And again, and you're absolutely right. The best argument against all these claims that, well, the Pilgrims came seeking religious liberty is, that was a long time before the founding of the United States of America. The Constitutional Convention is closer in time to the beginning of World War II than it is to the Mayflower Compact. Right? I mean, and the founders, when they looked back at that, they said, this is what we do not want. This is an example of how not to build a government.
Now, if you could, you've got the mic now, please.
I do. Yes. Hello. I am kind of curious as to what your own background. Did you grow up in a Christian or religious aspect? Second of all, have you been to one of the Barton events? I went to one in Stephenville. That was on a different day than the UFO that landed. Stephenville, Texas. And it was quite the dog and pony show.
Yeah.
So I've seen that for myself as to what goes on. And finally, the question that I really have for you is, in talking to people about the founding myth, how can you have a conversation with people that goes anywhere when they're believing things like Noah and first sin and all these other things? If they're that gullible to begin with, because I came from a Southern Baptist, so I get it. If they're that gullible to begin with, how can you even have a conversation? Or do you waste your time with that?
Yeah, no, well, I'll answer all of those.
Okay.
So the second, I've never been to a David Barton show. I've seen some clips. I try not to.
If you know of one, invite me.
I try not to give him too much bandwidth. Even in the book, I stick him in footnotes. And the first and third question are kind of related. I grew up in a pretty secular household. Just my mom raised me, really encouraged me to go to temple with my Jewish friends, to go to Mass with my Catholic friends. Apparently, after I went to Jeff Goldsmith's bar mitzvah, I came home and said, I want to be Jewish because that was the most fun I've ever had. But it became very clear to me early on, right, that all of these truth claims that these religions are making are on the basis of nothing other than we say it's the truth, so it's the truth. And so the obvious answer was, well, they're all wrong. And so I arrived at that pretty early on. And I stand in awe of people who were brought up in religious households and are able to escape from that. I don't think it's gullibility when you are believing as a child what your parents told you to believe. I don't think it's stupidity, though it's tempting to call it that. I mean, Dan Barker, who is the co-president of FFRF, I think he's probably the smartest person. Seriously, I think he's on a different plane sometimes. And he was a devout preacher, an evangelist traveling around Mexico trying to convert people. And he had the intellectual courage and fortitude to leave that behind, even though his entire livelihood, his entire life, his entire family was tied up in that. He could turn and say, this idea is wrong. But there was immense pressure on him, not just socially, but every kind of pressure you can possibly imagine, except that it was not true.
I would like to add to that there's a couple of people that I know that I think are absolute geniuses. that are smarter than me. There are people that I think that are smarter than me that have come away from a fundamentalist sort of a belief system that I was never involved in.
Yeah.
So while I will often declare that people are being dishonest when I can show that they are,
Yeah.
I can't necessarily say that it's stupidity.
No, and that's the central point I'm trying to make. Like, Dan didn't gain 50 IQ points when he decided that there was no God. It didn't happen overnight. He was that smart, right? He was not stupid and then all of a sudden became this smart guy when he became an atheist. I think it's wrong of secular Americans, non-religious Americans, to think of believers as stupid. I think they've been taught this, and a lot of times you don't question what you believe, and there's immense pressure to continue to believe it. It doesn't take anything to become an atheist other than to change your mind.
All right, I'd like to get another question from the audience, please. All right, you got the mic? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Tim Gorski. I'm involved in the leadership of the North
Hi,
Texas
Tim.
Church of Freethought. And I think that this very event shows we are really the yeast and the bread and the salt of the earth, because we're talking about important things that the believers never even consider. You know, in this book, Caught in the Pulpit, they talk about religious athleticism, where the people being trained to become preachers are actually told, here's the difficult thing in the Bible. Can your faith withstand this?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just ridiculous. But to get to what we're talking, you know, your book, how does the Christian nationalism relate to the Chalcedon Foundation, to Rushdoony, the Christian Reconstructionists? How much of that current has been carried into this movement?
It's a massive amount. So I don't differentiate between Reconstructionists, Rushdoony, Seven Mountain Dominionists. I don't care, Barton. I don't care what flavor or brand of Christian nationalist you are a Christian nationalist. And I would encourage everybody in this room to stop worrying about the differences between them or engaging in the differences between them and call them Christian nationalists. Drop the term theocrat, dominionist, all of it. Go with Christian nationalists. There was a poll that came out, Morning Consult did it in, I want to say, late March or early April, and they found out that 47% of the country view Christian nationalism as a threat. That was the first time that question was asked by any pollster, because before Trump, nobody knew that this was a thing that we needed to be worried about. So instinctively, people recognize that Christian nationalism is a threat to our nation. If you ask somebody, is Rushdoony or Seven Mountain Dominionism or Christian Reconstructionism, their eyes are glazed over before you finish the question.
But have those people gotten into are they the leaders of the Christian nationalism?
They are purveyors of Christian nationalism, absolutely.
As I mentioned, the reason that I became an activist myself was because of people who were motivated by Rushdoony, who were bragging about the number of senators who had connections to the Chalcedon Institute.
Yep.
But when I try to explain who Rushdoony is or what the Chalcedon Institute is to most Christians, they have no idea. It was the same thing in the 1990s when I would try to explain to a Christian group, hey, did you know that you're listening to, what is the crazy guy? Everything he says is nuts.
Dave Barton.
James Dawson.
Tony Perkins, Dave Barton, Brian Fisher.
There's so many options. Okay, yeah, so many names being thrown out. But he was on the Christian Coalition.
Ralph Reed.
No.
Okay.
There's so many. I could be talking about so many different people. But he it's like on the news. You know, he would say some crazy thing every week, and it would be the same news story like 20 years later. Pat Robertson would say something crazy. Yes, you know. So it's like when Pat Robertson said that earthquakes were caused by homosexuality, right? So in 1992, I think it was, maybe 94. I'm telling these Christians that, hey, did you listen to Pat Robertson say that to his 30,000 some odd followers that you should go out and kill homosexuals wherever you find them because that would prevent earthquakes? I can't get Christians to pay attention. They're asking me who Pat Robertson is.
Yeah, but if you say a Christian nationalist went out and said that, it changes it. I mean,
they will say that, well, he's not a true Christian. Well, maybe he's not a true Christian, but he's being funded by the donations that you're paying.
Yeah. But you end up sounding, I think, not you. One ends up sounding like somebody who's got red string up in their basement when you're talking about the Chalcedon Institute and funding. Christian nationalists are doing this. Christian nationalists are doing this. Christian nationalists want to corrupt our government. They are taking over our government. They are using the machinery of the state to promote their personal religion. Right? That is our message. It's a winning message.
I want to also mention that the Christian nationalist movement has moved away from the Chalcedon, because what the Chalcedon Institute was trying to promote when I became an activist myself was they wanted to replace our current representative democracy with a theocracy that would enforce Levitical law.
That's what the Bible calls for, though. I mean, right?
He said the Constitution should be rewritten.
Yeah. No more oysters either.
Oh, we got a question over here.
Okay, mine was kind of related to the lady over here. How do you deal with people who, I had a discussion with a lady on Facebook who I met through a former military friend who was praying for me to find Jesus. And during the discussion,
Did you look under the couch?
He's not in my house. I've already looked. I referenced Bart Ehrman. Are you familiar with Bart Ehrman? Okay.
Of course.
I referenced Bart Ehrman, and her comeback was, well, that's his opinion. As if her opinion, now I don't know that she's never studied ancient languages or such, but as if her opinion is just as valid as the man who studied ancient languages and whatever he needed to learn to be the outstanding and well thought of biblical scholar that he is.
I have to say...
Well, let's repeat for the people upstairs. Your question is basically, how do you deal with somebody who says, my opinion is just as valid as an expert?
Yeah, that's just his opinion.
Yeah,
I have differences of opinion with Bart Ehrman, but I have to note that he is the expert, not me. So what does my difference of opinion really matter?
Yeah, there's a guy named Tom Nichols who's, I think he's a professor at the Naval College. He's a conservative. He left the Republican Party after Trump. He wrote a book called The Death of Expertise. Yeah. And if you have not read that, I recommend reading that. This is what he talks about in the book. And he talks about how it happened. And it's fascinating and terrifying. And he's the expert on that, so I'll direct you to him for that answer.
I know that FFRF has taken on a lot of separation of church and state ideas and everything. But one of the big ones, will we ever in our lifetime get away from the national motto that we have right now and go back to E pluribus unum? I know y'all taking that on, and what I hear is it'll never be defeated.
No, it will be defeated. I don't know how old you are. It will be defeated within 50 years, I think, for sure.
Really?
Yeah, I know. I'm confident in this. There's two crucial things on this. First, we are not going to win this fight with the courts. We're going to win this fight with demographics, and everybody really ought to understand that. The courts were unfriendly before; they've only gotten worse, but they're not that great anyway. I had a law professor who likened the Supreme Court to the last person in on an all-team tackle, right? Everybody on the field jumped on top of the ball. The Supreme Court comes running along, jumps on top of the pile and says, "Look what I did, everybody." And gay marriage is a perfect example of this. They had many opportunities to do the right thing and declare that obviously two consenting adults have a right to marry regardless of their sex. They didn't do that until public opinion shifted, right? Now, there's a stretch in our history, the Warren Court, where the court was this great vindicator and protector of civil rights. But besides the Warren Court, the Supreme Court has done a terrible job. If you want to read more about that, Injustices is a book by Ian Millhauser. I highly recommend that. He writes for Think Progress. So we were never going to win this fight in the courts overall. We're going to win it with demographics first and foremost. The second thing is that the reason courts have held that our national motto, which is so very clearly a religious statement, comports with the First Amendment is that it has lost all religious significance. Through rote repetition, "In God we trust" is no longer religious. Now pause to appreciate the insane hypocrisy that is present in that. Because if a court was declaring that John 3:16 or that praying the rosary was no longer religious because it's so often repeated by believers, there would be a shitstorm on the other side. And rightfully so. They should be up in arms when a secular court declares that a very obviously religious motto or phrase or prayer is not religious. So there is this central hypocrisy and fiction at the heart of all of these cases that is sometime going to fall. The Bladensburg cross case, which was just decided, the 40-foot tall cross that we already talked about a little bit, the court upheld that because, yeah, sure, it's a 40-foot tall cross that is obviously to Jesus. It's also not religious. And this is the best part of that. It's so bad and so poorly written, so poorly reasoned. Justice Alito, who wrote the controlling opinion, said, yeah, the cross went up 90 years ago. 90 years ago, you guys. We could never know what people were thinking 90 years ago. And in the next section, he says, 230 years ago when the First Amendment was passed, we know exactly what the founders were thinking. And he goes on to explain that, of course, they thought it was perfectly acceptable to put up these monuments to Christianity. So he says that we know what people were thinking 230 years ago, but not 90 years. I mean, what? So the decisions on these they're so bad that they are going to fall.
Are you familiar with Governor Abbott of this state?
Yeah, we're suing Governor Abbott of this state right now. Governor Abbott of this state removed a Freedom from Religion Foundation display of the Bill of Rights from your state capitol because it was blasphemous and I can't remember the exact phrase that he used. We sued him for violating our First Amendment rights. He removed a display of the Bill of Rights. And the Statue of Liberty, and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. Imagine censoring the Bill of Rights. That's what he did. And he cited a 10-line George Washington prayer. He said that our display was fallacious and misleading, that it was a lie, basically. And to back that up, he cited a 10-line George Washington prayer that's a fake quote. No. George Washington did not say the lines that he used to justify revoking our...
But David Barton said he did.
Yep. I mean, this is how Christian nationalism is infecting our government, though.
I can actually add a little to that. When I was part of the group that put that display up, it was a Christmas display, and the governor had it removed on the day it was supposed to come down anyway. So it was in the rotunda in the bottom part, and it was an incredible gift because suddenly this thing that was going to go away and disappear became a huge story and made him look like a fool.
We got a question back here.
We got one out here in the
I will try to pick up the efficiency
Hold on.
and get to the audience for questions.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit of what in your book, you state that there's a difference between religion and morality, I believe in the first couple of chapters.
Say it again, between religion and morality?
Yes, in your book, in the first couple of chapters. And you give the impression that our founding fathers really thought themselves quite a bit different than the common person.
Oh, yeah, no, they definitely did.
And I wanted you, if you could elaborate a little bit.
I wonder, well, I'm not going to find it because if you want it, you could buy it. But and this argument is actually crucial. There's a number of places where the founding fathers talk about religion and morality, and they use that phrase. Quote religion and morality, and it's critical because it's a huge bullet for the Christian nationalists. But it's actually they're actually shooting themselves in the face when they use it, because what the founders meant is that religion and morality were two distinct things, right? Religion was a substitute for morality, not the source of morality for the founders. So they spoke about these two different things, and they thought that religion was necessary for the masses of mankind. That was one of the phrases that they used to get them to behave. Now they as the educated elite with libraries and leisure time could think about morality and use their reason and use their logic to arrive at moral conclusions and moral behavior on their own without the need for religion. They didn't have to have these set of rules that they had to follow. Okay? And this is critical because that means that it was religion for the masses, but reason for the founders. So if they're going to build a government, what principles are they going to turn to? Not religious principles, because they didn't use them in their everyday life. So it actually disproves the Christian nationalist point, makes my case for me. It means that the founders were moral without religion. It means that morality, not religion, guided their actions and guided the founding of this country. To me, that was one of the most crucial chapters in the book. And it's, I think, one of the hardest arguments to push back on, but it's really worth understanding the ins and outs of that because it completely undermines their entire case. And also, notice, too, that the founders didn't think religion was important for its truth claims, just that it guaranteed appropriate behavior, right? So it wasn't that Christianity was right, everybody should believe in it. It was that if people follow the tenets of Christianity, society will be a little bit better place. Any religion would have done, which is also another big strike against the Christian nationalists.
Another question from the audience, please.
Yeah, this might be a little off topic, but I find that people who believe in the myth that we are founded on Christian fundamentalism also seem to believe that we were founded on free market fundamentalism. And I'm wondering where this connection comes from.
I don't know where it comes from, but I would point you or point them to the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment prohibits...
Wait, the one that says, thou shalt not boil a baby goat in its own mother's milk?
The other 10th commandment. That's the 10th commandment in Exodus 34, which is the real 10th commandment, by the way. The 10th commandment in Exodus 20, which says, thou shalt not covet. And you cannot have a free market. The capitalism does not exist.
That's the basis of our economy.
Yeah. Coveting is absolutely crucial to America. So just point them to don't covet. Your neighbor's ass or slave. Slavery...
Or your neighbor's wife's ass.
Yeah. Slavery is mentioned twice in the Ten Commandments. Perfectly acceptable in the Ten Commandments. Punishing innocent children to the third and fourth generation.
But you know, he
totally good.
God declared that you shouldn't wear mixed fabrics.
Yeah. He got that wrong
too. That was something that God thought was important enough that he needed to write, that nobody would pay attention to. But he's going to lay down that. But for whatever reason, and Christians bring this up to me and say that God knew that he couldn't stop people from owning slaves, but God thought he could stop people from wearing cotton polyester blends.
I've actually always wondered. I've never done this research, but how many fabrics were there back then? Yeah. Really, they had hair shirts and what else? I don't know.
So being on the board of the local DFW chapter of FFRF, we get contacted a lot by people, one, wanting to know where the boundaries are with church-state violations. It happens a lot here, and back to school time right now especially is a big time that we hear from people that about prayer, about large displays of, crosses on the wall in the classroom or Bible verses or whatever. And so could you comment a little bit about where people can find out, first of all, if something is a violation, and then secondly, what they can do about it if it is indeed a violation?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I'm so glad you asked it. I'm going to say a few different things about it too. First, local groups right now are going to be more important than ever before, right? Because the courts are trending away from us, it is so critical to become a part of your local group, to support your local group, and to get involved in local activism. Just because that 40-foot tall cross in Bladensburg was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court doesn't mean that you couldn't get it taken down with local activism, right? Just because something is legal doesn't mean it has to be there. That's number one, which is not answering your question. Now to answer your question. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, we handle 5,000 state church complaints every single year. Half of those involve the public schools. Okay? The best thing to do is if you are concerned that there is a violation happening in your community, in your school, at your local government, go to our website, go to the legal tab, and click Report a State Church Violation. Right? You will hear from an attorney within a day or two at most. Maddie Ziegler, likely, she's our intake attorney. She will analyze your complaint. She will ask you a bunch of other questions. If you have enough information there for us to take action, it'll get funneled to an attorney who will talk with you about what to do. We will absolutely keep your information confidential. We act as a buffer between you and your kid's school. So if your teacher is telling your kindergartner that they have to pray before they go down to lunch every day, which happens, that's the case we were working on not too long ago, you come to us, we write a letter to the superintendent saying, we understand this is happening. It was reported to us by a concerned ex-school district community member. So you are protected, your child is protected, and the violation can usually be fixed. We cure, in the neighborhood, 300 to 400 average state church violations without going to court every single year. That's our bread and butter. That is what we do. So if you get one of these violations, come to us. If you're not sure if it's a violation, report it to us anyway, and we will tell you. If you are just curious and kind of want to learn more about what might be a violation and what's not, also on that legal tab on our website, we have an FAQ list, which has a ton of information, tons of different questions, and really, we actually have a short answer and then a more long-form answer that directs you to legal cases and things like that if you want to know, and what you can also do in certain to help uphold the separation of state and church.
Some of you are here from the Fellowship of Freethought and heard Rex and I present last Sunday, and I got schooled by Andrew on this because we did a long thing about standing, about how you have to have standing if you're going to try to have any kind of case against these school or government entities that are doing these things, and we were off base. So do not let that idea stop you from contacting the FFRF.
Yeah, you have to have standing to sue in court. That you don't have to have standing to cure a violation with a letter.
I remember my daughter told the story about See with the flagpole that our local schools were doing, where they all go out to, all the students would like hold on to the flagpole as if it's a conduit for prayers, and the teachers are all gathered around. The teachers are not supposed to lead children in prayer, but
Correct.
that's exactly what they're doing. And they're saying that it's outside the building, so it's not on school grounds, but it is on school grounds. It's their damn flagpole.
Yeah.
Right? Because you need a flagpole, because you need the aluminum or steel or whatever the hell it is as you needed the antenna, right? And my daughter made a comment to this effect, right? And it was one of the other girls that whispered to her, and I thought it was a funny thing that there's a huge crowd of students, and one of the other kids identifies my daughter as the skeptic and said, "Atheist, no." You are outnumbered.
Yeah, and that's why FFRF is here to help you fight those battles.
All right, another question from the audience?
Yes, this is Pathways Unitarian Universalist Church, and we're delighted that you're all here. And you're welcome to join us any Sunday you want at 10 a.m. We don't have all the answers, but we ask great questions.
That's the more important part.
And a lot of community events happen here as well, scouts, book discussion groups, and there's a discussion group that meets here every Sunday at 11:30.
We had two other questions over here in this corner. Two hands that went readily up. Raise your hands again, please. There we go. They're in the corner, both of them.
I've seen some evidence lately that even Christians are concerned with the current state of political affairs. There's a book that I just noticed this week called The Immoral Majority, written by a Christian who's argued that the conservative Christian movement has basically abandoned their principles and values for the sake of political power, to keep Trump in charge, in control, as their own. So it's changing the face of that movement. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, no, there's actually, in the past 2 weeks, there's been a movement called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And there have been a number of, Cornel West, a number of other leading Christian figures are coming out against Christian nationalism itself. It goes back to kind of what I was talking about earlier about how liberalism often drags conservative religion into these liberal policies. But I mean, I think it's also really indicative of the power of the separation of state and church. I mean, there is no freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion. I cannot repeat that often enough. I've given whole talks.
Do you have to explain it? Because I have to explain it every time I bring it up.
Yeah, you do. I mean, but a secular government is the best protector for the freedom of religion. I mean, one of the reasons we have a separation of state and church, when James Madison was arguing against this tax in Virginia that would have supported Christian teachers, he wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments. If you haven't read it, go home and read it. It's probably like 5 pages if you were to print it out today.
The title is almost as long as the book.
Yeah. It's 15 bullet points. And a lot of the arguments he makes are religious arguments, right? He said later on in a letter that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they're mixed together. Right? And that's crucial to what you're talking about. What these Christians are arguing is that this concern for politics and for political power is tainting our religion. I don't know whether that's right. I don't care. It's a good argument for them to make, and I want them to continue to make it. And it's also a very effective argument for you to make here in Texas. Religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they're mixed together. Anything we can do to keep state and church separate, I am absolutely all for. And I would make religious arguments too. One of the popular claims I hear is, you would never quote the Bible if you were an atheist or a non-believer. Like if they ever mention the Bible, like of course.
I always quote Ecclesiastes 3:18-21.
I quote it all the time. My favorite is Matthew 6:5, when Jesus condemns public prayer as hypocrisy. Like I write that in letters to public officials all the time. Anyway, that was a little tangent. Matthew 10:35 is also kind of nice.
In your book, you mentioned in Article 3 of the Constitution, it explicitly forbids punishing children for the crime of their parents.
Yeah.
So how exactly does Christian nationalism take this concept, the concept of original sin, and square it with this very clear part of the Constitution? It's diametrically opposed to it.
No, it is diametrically opposed, and it cannot be squared. Christian nationalism does not attempt to square it, and that's why I wrote the book. And it's not just... there are so many parts of the Bible that you can point to where that happens. Again, the Ten Commandments. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. That is really immoral and insanely barbaric. Punishing innocent children for the crimes of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. You cannot reconcile that with the American system of law and justice. And I should say, too, a lot of our system of law and justice is aspirational. It's founded on ideals that we have not yet fully realized, and we may not fully realize for a while. That doesn't change the fact that we should still continue to strive and do so.
I came from San Antonio. I was a former president of the Freethinkers of Central Texas there.
I was just there last night.
I know, and I didn't know where you met. I was going to ask you, did the Freethinkers help you find a place? Or
yeah, no, they hosted, and there was a lovely event. It was.
I'm jealous.
So Texas, Dallas is better, but
and
Fort Worth is better. I thought it was Hearst, technically. Okay, all right then. Take it easy, Fort Worth.
I just don't want you to not tell everybody here that we're going to have a national convention. I'm a member of your
Yes.
group, and we're having a national convention not this November, but the next November, 2020, in San Antonio, Texas. So don't tell me you can't afford to get to San Antonio.
Yeah, the Freedom from Religion Foundation convention next fall is in San Antonio. So be there or be square, go to hell. I don't know. Whatever's scary for you, I don't know. We do like 2 more, and then that's probably going to sign. I don't want.
Okay, we got time for a couple more questions,
and then I'll sign and sell as many books as people want.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I just wonder, how do you see your rhetorical endpoint to this project? My worry here is always that I don't get the sense that people who are in the vanguard of the Christian nationalist movement are historians.
Oh,
I don't get the sense that they're philosophers. I get the sense that they're power-hungry, bigoted ignoramuses who aren't going to care about what's in your book.
Yes.
So who's your audience and what's your goal?
Fantastic question. Really fantastic question. Two audiences, really, for this. The first is you, out here right now, which is why you should buy the book if you haven't got it already.
Primarily because you're activists, and so you're actually going to do something with this information.
And because the goal was to give you better arguments and better information so that you can start actually changing minds. I can tell you, I worked on this book for 8 years. I road tested these arguments. These aren't just things I threw together. They work. They have changed minds. They're changing minds today. The second audience is the 50% of the country that isn't really engaged on these issues, but could be convinced that Christian nationalism is a threat and is absolutely wrong. And I'm not worried about the extreme vanguard of Christian nationalist thought. What I'm trying to do is relegate those fuckers back to the fringe where they belong.
My name is Asia Jackson. I'm the president of the Secular Student Alliance at UTD. And so my question is, so my interest in religion happened in elementary school when I was 12. I had a teacher who decided they wanted to add world religions into the curriculum. So not just Christianity. We learned about Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, everything. And so my question is, have you ever encountered a problem where someone reported that a school, elementary, middle school or something, is wanting to teach a Bible class, and then you go to them and, well, no, you can't do that, and you can teach everything? Like, do you think it's possible that can happen in the future, where instead of the ones who like, let's teach Bible school, it's like, no, you have to teach everything if you're gonna do that?
So absolutely. The road to atheism is littered with Bibles that have been read cover to cover. That's me. That's a meme that somebody made of me. It's from the book.
I've also heard that if you study one religion, you might be a devotee of that religion, but if you study more than one religion, you'll be an atheist.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah. If you can, I have no opposition to world religions or even the Bible being taught in the public schools the right way. But you can teach, but not preach. You can educate, but not indoctrinate. Those are the rules. So if you want to teach kids about the Bible, you have to teach them, for instance, that the word virgin didn't actually really appear in the Bible, that it's based on a mistranslation of the... Yeah, all right. And when you teach that in the public schools, it's going to have a much different impact than when you let a teacher preach. The problem is that once you institute these classes, teachers go off on their own. Mark Chancey here in Texas did a study with Texas Freedom Network. He's done this twice now, of the Bible classes throughout this state. And the vast majority of them are mistaught. The curriculum is completely biased. And you probably can speak to this more than I can.
Actually, I can. I'm a social studies teacher in the Irving School District, and I do a 3-week part of the curriculum on world religions. And I got to say, for the state of Texas, I don't find a lot of bias in it, but it would be so easy if you wanted to put it in there that it's there.
And that's the problem that we see. And I'll tell you at FFRF, we see this all the time, where the state regulation is properly drafted and passed, and if it was taught that way, it would be fine. But then when you get down to the teacher's preaching and indoctrinating.
It would be no problem at all. And I think it's important because all religions have a huge impact on humankind, human history, and kids need to understand this and what role it has played. But you got to understand all of them, and I could see very easily how that could be manipulated.
Yeah, it absolutely can.
Looks like we have 2 more questions. Then we'll
You already had a turn.
Yeah.
Concluding questions,
All right, we'll just do these 2 real quick, and then we'll be done.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Andrew, I really appreciate you being here. I'm the treasurer at Pathways. I'm not going to take any of those remarks you said earlier about treasurer spending money on Grindr. That's not here.
It wasn't a treasurer. It was just a priest, man.
No, we don't do that.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I appreciate you being here. I've learned a lot. I'm going to buy a copy of your book. I wasn't, but I am now because this sounds really interesting. My question is, what is the intersection between Christian nationalism and white nationalism?
Ooh. Yeah, good. Super good question. So the Venn diagram for that looks pretty close to a circle. It's true. I mean, and there's a lot of really awful passages in the Bible, exclusivity in the Bible. I mean, Martin Luther King. I read his letter to the Birmingham jail every MLK day. I love it. It's one of my favorite pieces of writing ever. He wrote that to his fellow preachers. People forget that. He often spoke of the church as a tail light instead of a headlight. Historically, it's been very, very bad for the most part on civil rights issues. Again, it goes back to what I was talking about secularism dragging religion into liberal stances. Andrew Whitehead is a researcher at the University of Clemson who's done a ton of research on Christian nationalism, its ties to white nationalism, and its ties to guns, actually. There's a big belief in Christian nationalism that your right to own a gun is a God-given right. I mean, that's not. Yeah, I kind of agree with your GPS there. Christian nationalism is this fascinating and toxic mix of some of the worst parts of Christianity, and mixed with all these other very odd and extreme fringe things that have made it into the mainstream. I didn't get into that as much in my book. I found it to be a little bit of a distraction, so I did have some stuff written about that, and we ended up cutting that.
I can see why.
But it really is fascinating. If you want to learn more about that, I would just Google Andrew Whitehead Clemson. He has given a couple interviews recently on podcasts, especially in the wake of El Paso, where he was kind of going over this. He did a really long form interview with the Salt Lake Tribune. The reporter's name escapes me. It's Kelsey something. She covers the Supreme Court for the Salt Lake Trib. He did a nice interview with her, kind of going over some of this. That'd be good. Interested in learning more. I think this is the final question, I think, and then I have to go sell and sign books. Happy to answer questions out there, though.
Okay, so technically it's 2 questions. One question is
you got a turn.
You mentioned several books. Are you going to be posting a reading list somewhere, or I'll get those from you whenever you're signing books. All right. Now the actual concluding question. Obviously, we are all here as activists, and you go and you state that as activists we should be active in changing the culture around us, and even though it may be legal, we can still remove it because that's what the people want. What are actionable things that we can do right now with the local group? I'm sure Randall can help us with that as well.
Yeah, join other national groups that you like. If you are not a member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, please do join. The work that we do is critical now more than ever. If FFRF is not your cup of tea, join American Atheists, join the American Humanist Association, join Center for Inquiry, Americans United, ACLU. If you can, join and support them all. We all need it right now. Get out the vote, run for office. I already talked about those. Buy the book and arm yourself with better arguments. If you can't buy the book, get it from your library. If you want to do more, review the book. Tell your library to get a copy. Seriously, though, if you liked the book, please review it. If you don't review it.
I have one question of my own.
Yeah.
I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times to get out and vote, and because this is going to be on video. right, on a couple of different YouTube channels. So there are going to be people who argue that we shouldn't vote, it's a broken system, so protest by abstaining. How do you address those people? I want you to address those people now.
The one party in this country is desperately trying to stop people from voting. I was a poll watcher during the 2016 election. I saw firsthand what the Wisconsin voter ID law did to prevent people from voting, to suppress the vote. And that's just what I saw while I was at the polls, not the people who stayed home because they threw their hands up in frustration thinking, I don't even know if I can vote with this ID that I have or with this. They would not be trying to take away your right to vote if it was not so crucial. More people didn't vote in the last election than did, which is, to me, just...
Which is how we got into the shit we're in.
It is absolutely how we got to where we are.
I like the way he cleaned that up.
You only have one voice. You really do. I mean, it makes a difference if you call your senators and you call your representatives. It really does make a difference. I know a lot of people think it doesn't. You feel like they're apathetic.
In Texas, we really don't think that.
It does. And it does because the only thing they care about is getting reelected. Right? The only thing they care about is what you think. Now, they hear more from one side than the other. But the only thing they care about is what you think, because the only thing they care about is getting reelected, which means your vote is the only thing that matters. You have got to get out there and vote. That is really the only voice you have. And if you are not using it, you absolutely are powerless. Right? They want you to think you're powerless before you use it. That's absolutely the goal. So, I mean, that is the one voice you have, and you damn well better use it.
Yeah. Much as I love and respect George Carlin, he had the position that your vote doesn't count. And I have to contest that he was wrong about it.
Absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
All right, everybody.
I quote him like a couple times in the book, but he was absolutely wrong on that.
I'm going to ask one of our board members, Owen Younger, to come up. He's got a presentation he wants to make to Andrew. If everyone could just hold tight for just a minute here.
Before he does that, where were y'all hiding the beer?
It was just presented to me. I don't know. I think we prayed for it. Yeah. Maybe somebody did a...
Just water before.
Yeah.
Right.
Blessed it and it became beer.
Aaron Ra might have done something to it, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a blessing. Love your show. My name is Owen. We want to thank you for coming out and supporting the local organization and for the work that you're doing. I'm a member of the FFRF, and if you're not, I encourage you to. It's one of the most valuable advocacy groups that we can be in as free thinkers. So a little bit of backstory. We're going to gift something to Andrew in appreciation for him coming here this week and being in Texas. When Dan Barker came out in October for our inaugural sort of public kickoff for the local FFRF chapter here in Texas, in Dallas, we gifted to Dan an ancient Roman coin. I'm in a room full of nerds. I know that I am, but I'm a huge nerd. Like, I really am. And I'll put my nerd chops up against anybody. I collect ancient Roman coins. And we gifted to Dan a coin of Roman Emperor Constantine that was minted in about 327 in the city Thessalonica, which is that you'll recognize that if you've read the New Testament. So I was thinking about Andrew and thinking about his book, and I decided that I was going to theme my coin choice for another victim of an earlier problem with Christian nationalism. Anybody know the story of Roman Emperor Licinius? Okay, he met an unfortunate end in the year 324 of the Common Era. He was executed at the orders of Constantine the Great. And you guys know Constantine. He's the first Christian emperor. Right. So this is a coin of Emperor Licinius. It was minted in Antioch, another city that we're familiar with, in the year 313 or 314-ish. So this is a 17 centuries old coin that attests to the dangers of Christian nationalism.
Thank you so much. Oh my word. It's very cool. Thank you so much. really appreciate that.
And
cool.
for his help on this night, something more accustomed to his likings, we got Aaron a beer. So.
Is that one of the ones you bought?
I figured they were the same equivalent value, right? All right, okay. One more round of applause for this great presentation of these two guys. Thank you so much. What's that? Damn. Okay, I'm going to let them go down and set up. And if you could go with them, Aaron, and sit out there, and we're going to do a quick cleanup. So go ahead and go down.
Okay. I'll take the beer that I bought.